Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture 14 for History 101. And when we left off last time, we were talking about Hamilton's 3 economic reports to Congress and the development of the 2 political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So today we want to pick up with the Washington administration. We'll be mainly focusing upon the foreign policy of his 2 terms in the White House. So, the first thing that we want to talk about today is what's going to occupy the first foreign policy attention of the Washington administration is what happens in France in 1792-1793. There's a revolution that takes place in France, and one thing you need to remember is communications are not the best. Obviously, there's no television crews on site in Paris beaming back reports of what has happened in France. So initially, what the United States believe occurred over there was the overthrow of a tyrant king. So we were sort of patting ourselves on the back when we found out that Louis XVI had been overthrown and that we initially thought a democratic regime had taken over in France. So it's kind of like we're in the position, look what we started. We overthrew a tyrant king. Now we have a democratic regime in the brand new United States. The democratic fever is spreading to Europe. But then pretty quickly reports came in that this was no democratic revolution. This was what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. And a pretty good exhibit of what it was all about is in your textbook on page 192. There's a famous painting there showing you what these armed thugs that took over the French government's favorite tool for enforcement was in the famous painting of the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette in 1793 using the guillotine. And these armed thugs who took over the government were literally ruling with a reign of terror. So what George Washington's going to be faced with is diplomats representing this brand new French government come to meet with President Washington. And what's happening at the same time, a war is breaking out between France and their brand new government and England. And as we know from the past, these 2 nations fight more than they're at peace. So what the French diplomats want to know from President Washington is, when can they expect American troops to arrive in France to assist the French in defeating the British? And the reason why they believe these troops should be arriving is a treaty signed back in 1778, the Franco-American Treaty. That's the one that forged the alliance between the United States and France and brought French troops to North America to fight side by side with then General Washington. It's that treaty that was negotiated after the decisive victory at Saratoga by Benjamin Franklin in France. And according to that treaty, in the future, if a war broke out between France and England, we were supposed to more or less return the favor. Well, President Washington knew a couple of things. One, he wasn't going to assist this government based on terror, and the United States was in no position to be assisting anyone in a war. We were still struggling to find ourselves after recently adopting the Constitution. And another thing that was a major factor that we'll be talking about more today, the British are our neighbors to the north. and they have not evacuated all their forts on our territory yet. So any attack by us helping the French would quickly be retaliated by the British right on our own soil. So basically, President Washington tells the French diplomats, you can never expect American troops coming to assist you. And what he does, basically, is he, as President of the United States, abrogates the Franco-American Treaty of 1778, meaning he makes it null and void. So, and then he issues his neutrality proclamation of 1793, saying the United States will remain neutral in this conflict. And the French aren't happy, and neither are the brand new Democratic Republicans, that new party, the opposition to Washington and the Federalists, because, as you might remember, we call them the Jeffersonians, and the leader of their party, Thomas Jefferson, thinks very highly of the French, not only because they assisted us in the Revolutionary War, but remember, he gained his foreign policy experience by being the diplomat to France in the early days under the Articles of Confederation, living in Paris for several years. So, they're not happy, but George Washington utilizes the following argument to back up his abrogation of this treaty. He argues that the Franco-American Treaty, signed in 1778, was signed by a government twice removed from the government that he is president of. And he points out that treaty was signed by a revolutionary government, the government that preceded the Articles of Confederation. Then remember, that government was replaced by the Articles of Confederation, 1781 to 1788, and now Washington is president of a nation operating under technically our third government, the Constitution. So he says he is not obligated to uphold a treaty that's twice removed, and has no intention of doing so. And he instructs the Democratic Republicans in Congress, if they disagree with him, then use their power to declare war on England, and then he'll have no choice. Now, he knows they're in the minority in Congress, and they could never muster enough votes to make this declaration anyway. But he points out to them that's their option. So, we stay out of this war. The next thing that we want to talk about on the foreign policy front is we want to take a look at the map on page 196, because we're going to use this map to interpret some major battles that are going to take place out in the Old Northwest Territory, and also the Jay Treaty that will follow. Now, if you take a look at this map, I've been mentioning that the British still have forts on American territory. And you can see those British forts on this map. And in fact, two of them are right up in our neck of the woods, as you'll notice on map 9-1 on 196. The British had a fort at Pointe, a spot we've talked about many times, right here in the North Country, 4 miles south of Rouse's Point. The fort that they had constructed there was a blockhouse known as the White House back in this day and age. They still held that, even though it's U.S. territory. They had also constructed a fort across the lake in Vermont at Dutchman's Point. You can see there's other forts in the state of New York, including Oswego and Niagara. Then there are there's Fort Miami in what will become the state of Ohio. Then a couple of forts in what will become the state of Michigan, all held by the British on U.S. territory. Now, part of the reason why they're especially holding these forts in the Northwest Territory is because we've never paid them the debt that we owed them, that we agreed to pay them after the Revolutionary War was over, as designated by the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So, they're kind of holding the Northwest Territory hostage, so to speak. And as Americans try to settle there, the British are going to rile up their ally Indian tribes to attack settlers. So settlement in the old Northwest Territory is sort of up in the air still. So the United States, once we're up and operating under the Constitution, have money to do so, we're going to send the United States military out to the Northwest Territory to engage some of these Indian allies of the British. And you'll notice the little bombs going off in present-day Indiana and in the present-day state of Ohio, even though that one bomb's kind of misplaced on the map there. You'll notice that General Harmer was defeated by Indian forces in 1790, followed by General St. Clair's defeat in 1791. That's the same General St. Clair from Fort Ticonderoga, the one who abandoned it when Burgoyne put cannons on the top of Mount Defiance. He's a career military man. And then finally, there's an American breakthrough and huge victory. You can see labeled on the map, Wayne's Victory at Fallen Timbers, 1794. Let me tell you a little bit about this particular battle. General Anthony Wayne, who is also known by the nickname of Mad Anthony Wayne, because he's a pretty unique character. In regular life, he's a really reserved, quiet guy. Put him on the battlefield, and he literally turns into a madman. He also is a career military man. He was an officer in the Revolutionary War. Major Anthony Wayne was stationed up and down the Champlain Valley, including at Mount Independence and so forth, fought very bravely, and he remained in the military, and now he's leading forces out in the Northwest Territory. Now, he's going to engage a group of several Indian tribes who are allied with the British at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which actually occurs right on the same river that you can see Fort Miami is located on. And it happens, the little bomb going off is misplaced. The Battle of Fallen Timbers happens approximately 5 miles upstream on that river, even though it's not labeled. That's the Maumee River in the state of Ohio today. I know quite a bit about this general area and this battle because I did my graduate work at Bowling Green State University, which is further upstream on the Maumee in Bowling Green, Ohio. So I've been to all these sites when I was in college, and later on I also was a scholar at a workshop held one summer, paid for by the National Endowment of the Humanities in Michigan and Ohio, where we studied the War of 1812 over there in the field. So, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Anthony Wayne is going to defeat Native American groups, several different tribes. One of the main tribes that was engaged in this were the Shawnee, whose homelands were in the state of Indiana. Now, what's going to happen is, after he defeats them at Fallen Timbers, the Native Americans will retreat downstream, headed to Fort Miami, the British fort, because the British had told them, if you're ever in this situation and you need to retreat from American forces, you can seek sanctuary at Fort Miami, the British fort. So the Indians retreated with Anthony Wayne and his forces in hot pursuit. And what happens is the British will betray these Native American allies. They will not open the gates of the stockade fort at Fort Miami. And what will happen in the aftermath of that is Anthony Wayne and his American forces will catch up with them, and he'll slaughter many of these Indians who are caught between him and the wooden stockades of the British fort. And the British sit idly by and watch this happen. The reason why they betrayed their Indian allies, at the same exact time negotiations were going on in England between John Jay and the British to try to settle this issue about having British forts on American territory. And the British had been instructed not to do anything to screw up these negotiations. Now, the one tribe that I mentioned before that's engaged in this, the Shawnee, never really did trust the British. So instead of fleeing to the fort, they cut across the river and took sanctuary on the other side. They watched while their Indian brothers were slaughtered in front of the British fort. One young warrior who watched all this will become quite important in the near future, and that's the famous Shawnee warrior Tecumseh. He'll watch all this unfold, and it will really give him a jaundiced eye towards white settlers, whether they're British or Americans in general. So, next what we want to talk about is the Jay Treaty that I mentioned the negotiations were going on. President Washington, in 1794, will send the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Jay, who we mentioned before, also one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, to England to negotiate a settlement to get these forts off American territory once and for all before it ends up causing a potential war between us and the British. So, at these negotiations, Washington briefs him before he sets sail for England and tells him that, he's authorized to negotiate a certain amount of money to pay the British that we, supposedly owe them in order to get the forts removed from our territory. But he also warns him that be prepared, they're gonna, that you must ask for a concession from them to appease some political interests in America. And what the concession that he's going to at least have to play lip service to, even though Washington instructs him there's no way the British will do this, is he's going to have to ask for compensation for slaves that were set free by the British in 1783 at the end of the Revolutionary War, when the British were evacuating the 13 colonies. What the British had done is let it be known that if slaves fled their masters and made it down to port cities like Charleston, South Carolina, even New York City, that they would be given safe passage on British ships as they evacuated British personnel out of the colonies, either back to England or to Newfoundland and up in Nova Scotia or down in the Caribbean. Because by that point in history in 1783, the British had already abolished slavery in the rest of the British holdings. So a sizable number of slaves were given their freedom by traveling on British ships out of the former colonies. And angry Southerners especially wanted compensation for what they considered lost property. Now, Washington told Jay, you and I both know the British are never going to give us any money for that, but you at least have to ask for it. You can bargain it away for something else, but you got to play lip service to it. So the negotiations took place. Jay successfully negotiated what becomes known as the Jay Treaty of 1794, and he gets the British to agree to evacuate all those forts I pointed out to you on the map on page 196 for a set sum of money that the Americans would pay, and obviously in the end, they're not going to give the United States any compensation for those lost slaves. Now, when Jay returns to the United States with this treaty, Washington's delighted, but there's grumblings in Congress among the Democratic Republicans because they also are a party of the South. And there's stories floating around that Jay, who many of them know, is a member of the same abolitionist societies in New York City as Alexander Hamilton, really was not very persistent in attempting to get this compensation for the slaves. So grumblings come about that not only is the Senate, who ratifies treaties, not going to ratify the Jay Treaty, but then they're going to go forward after that and start impeachment hearings on President Washington, claiming he violated the Constitution and was really concerned with opening up the Northwest Territory because of all the land holdings he had out there. Remember, we saw his name on that land speculators list on that handout associated with Dr. Baird's economic interpretation of the Constitution. So, Washington knows how important Jay's Treaty is. We got to get the British off our soil, or sooner or later we'll be fighting them. Later we will be fighting them in the War of 1812, but at least it's, the peace lasts till then. So what he does is he goes ahead and really promotes this, what really is a rumor about this proposed impeachment, and Americans are furious. And they get a hold of their senators and their members of Congress and tell them, you better fall in line and do what the president wants, and you're certainly not going to impeach him, because if you do, we'll be down there with our guns to remove you. So, the Senate falls in line, ratifies Jay's Treaty, and the British evacuate those forts, including the two right up here on Lake Champlain. So the final piece of foreign policy that we want to talk about today is a treaty negotiated by Undersecretary of State Pinckney with the the Spanish in 1795. And to understand the ramifications of this treaty, as your textbook also instructs you to do on page 198, they tell you to see map 8.3 on page 168. So let's take a look at map 8.3 on 168. Now, what this treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, is all about, after the Jay Treaty is signed, Spain completely misinterprets it. And they believe that the Jay Treaty is really a secret alliance between the United States and England. Those sort of alliances occurred back then. As we know, it wasn't. It was to avoid warfare. So Spanish diplomats contact the Washington administration, and they assign this to Undersecretary of State Pinckney. What the Spanish offer to him, he can hardly believe. If you take a look at that map, you can see that little square that's labeled disputed by Spain and the United States. It's a large chunk of land in present-day Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. They tell the United States, we will withdraw any claims that we have to that land, so it's yours, and we will also give you complete access to the port of New Orleans, which is very important because our Western farmers who are now starting to settle in Ohio and the Northwest Territory use the Ohio River and the Mississippi River as a transportation route to get their crops to market, because it's much easier than trying to transport them by wagon through the Appalachian Mountains, because there are no roads through the Appalachian Mountains back then. The Pennsylvania Turnpike obviously doesn't exist. So, what do the Spanish want in return? For us to agree that we will not team up with the British and attack Spanish holdings in North America. Well, Pinckney has no problem agreeing to that. We never had any intention of doing that. Spanish diplomats completely misinterpreted Jay's treaty. So, this is quite a windfall for the Americans, but it also signals to us Spain is a crumbling empire. It's fallen apart. They had tried to control way too much territory in the Western Hemisphere, and now they're losing it left and right. And we were the recipients of this particular windfall. So, that's the end of Washington's foreign policy lecture. I'll be returning in a few minutes after I take a break, and we're going to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion and George Washington's famous farewell address. So I'll talk to you in a few. Bye now.